This is Chapter 18, The Cold War, Discussion Number 1, Beginning of the Cold War. After World War II was over, the main European powers that have dominated world history of Great Britain and France and Germany and Italy pretty much are taking a back seat. They've pretty much destroyed themselves, and the two powers that we have left are the United States and the Soviet Union. However, there's a large amount of distrust between the two. Probably has something to do with the Comintern created by communist Soviet Russia, that its sole process was to destroy the world or take over the world in the name of communism, which kind of made the United States and the free powers a little bit nervous. In the process, though, a lot of people thought that the Soviet Union was not going to be the best government to live under, and so many times people would leave the Soviet-dominated areas of Eastern Europe and try to escape to the free areas. The Soviet Union did not like this idea, so they put up a wall. The Berlin Wall was started in the city of Berlin, which is deep inside of East Germany, which was the Soviet-controlled areas, and then they built a wall to pretty much divide all of Europe from the rest of Europe so that people would be forced to stay in the eastern sectors. However, this was not the only thing that was going on. People who were very unhappy with Soviet domination revolted against the Soviet-controlled governments of Eastern Europe, revolts against the German government, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Non-communist leaders were imprisoned or executed. Radio stations were taken over. The Czech leader declared democracy, and then he was invaded by the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact armies. This was called Prague Spring, as it was kind of taking care of the Soviet power and warming up to democracy, and then the ice cube came in, so to speak, the Soviet Union, and said, if you're going to declare freedom, you're not going to happen. But outside the Soviet Union, in these Eastern European countries, was not the only place they had problems. They also had problems from people inside Soviet Russia who had problems with how things were being done, and that it was not the most effective way to be governed. Some of the more famous names of people who criticized Soviet Russia's government was Nathan Sharansky, a Jew who spoke for democracy and was then sent to the Gulag, essentially the Russian version of jail, and many times it's Siberia, for what he was saying. Andrei Sakharov was a Soviet scientist. Now, scientists kind of had a special protection going on because they were scientists and the Soviet Union was trying to keep up with the United States. And so they didn't get thrown into jail, but Andrei Sakharov actually won a Nobel Prize. I believe it was in physics, as he spoke against the Soviet repression of civil liberties. Another famous guy who won a Nobel Prize was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote books called the Gulag Archipelago, against the ideas of how political prisoners were being treated. But Soviet Russia is not the only communist power that was going on during this time of after World War II. China also was a big power of communism. However, China wanted to do things its own way. Remember that during World War II, Mao Zedong and Jiang Zeshi were fighting with each other against Japan. But once Japan was defeated and surrendered, these two Chinese powers went back to fighting against each other. However, Mao's policies during the Long March gathered a lot of favor from farmers. He said to treat the farmers well, and what happened then as we treated the farmers well is that they started liking the communists, and then as they started liking the communists, they started not feeding the cities, which made life very difficult for Jiang Zeshi. What happened is that the nationalists underneath Jiang Zeshi eventually were expelled China proper, and they went to the island of Taiwan and established their own government. Now, the national government in the Republic of China, which is what we call Taiwan, is a country in and of itself, and for a long period of time, the United Nations recognized that government in Taiwan as being the true government of China. However, in the 1960s and 70s, it got to the point where people realized that while Taiwan was a small island off the coast of China, they really weren't telling China what to do. And so it was replaced. Taiwan is now recognized by the United Nations to be a separate country, But the People's Republic of China, which was led by Mao, is now the considered government of the Chinese mainland. One of the things that's kind of interesting, though, is that while Taiwan does not listen to a single thing that China says, China still considers that island of Taiwan to be a part of their country, and it's just a renegade province who is listening to the appropriate home country. In mainland China, the People's Republic of China, Mao forced the collectivization that's endemic of the communist ideology, banned counter-revolutionary thought. Essentially, anyone who said anything bad about China, about Mao, or about anything dealing with the communist government in China to be imprisoned. China stopped cooperating with the Soviet Union because it wanted to do its own thing, and they had a different way of doing communism. And so the United States opened up discussions with China later on in the 1970s as an effort to try to continue to stop the Soviet Russia, maybe fostering some better relations with communist China. However, one of the big things about the Cold War that really needs to be mentioned is the idea of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons ended World War II when the United States dropped those 2 bombs on Japan. However, people realized that these mighty weapons are going to be a problem in and of themselves. Eventually, Soviet Russia is able to garner for itself these super weapons, these nuclear weapons of atom bombs and hydrogen bombs, and then they raced to build as many as they could so that they could supposedly get more weapons to use against the other side that make this a winning idea. The big problem with that concept, though, is that people were beginning to realize that having more bombs didn't necessarily mean that you were going to win. Concepts of nuclear winter and radiation killing off the planet really discouraged people from this idea of using the nuclear weapons to begin with. While you might use the nuclear weapon a day or two, you could say, yes, I won because we blew up more of you, realizing that if you did launch weapons, that everyone would launch against you and essentially everyone would be destroyed. Also was a discouragement against using the nuclear weapons. This was called mutual assured destruction. So, with the process of the amount of nuclear weapons and to realize that there needed to be some cooperation as far as how many nuclear weapons there were going to be, the United States and the Soviet Union entered into talks in order to reduce the threat of nuclear war. The 2 big talks were the SALT talks and the ABM talks. The SALT talks, the strategic, essentially were agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union of how much of the nuclear missiles they could have and what types of nuclear missiles they could have. They also had a discussion as far as the anti-ballistic missile treaty, where the use of missiles in order to stop nuclear missiles from hitting your country. The idea, if one country's anti-ballistic missile defenses were actually capable of stopping a retaliatory attack, that would mean that the first strike by the lesser-equipped country would actually produce a winnable war. So the idea that you're not allowed to defend yourself, that no one will actually want to hit the button, was the idea behind the ABM treaty. However, the United States and the Soviet Union are not the only countries that have nuclear weapons. By the time that we get to the 1960s, several countries have been able to develop the countries we have listed: Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Great Britain, France, United States, Israel. Were all pretty quick in getting their own nuclear weapons. North Korea has since joined the nuclear weapons. Obtained in the 2000s. A lot of people think that Iran is very close to getting its own nuclear weapon, but most of the countries that started out, the United States, China, India, Pakistan, Great Britain, France, United States, and Israel, have pretty much said that they will do everything they can in order to make sure that no other nuclear weapons. The idea is that if we have one country who is no longer able to maintain control of nuclear weapons, that they could get into the hands of terrorists or into irresponsible countries. And that those irresponsible countries might actually want to use it in their zealotry. So that is one of the Cold War. This concludes Chapter 18, The Cold War, Discussion 1, The Beginnings of the Cold War.